In the bustling heart of Maplewood, where the aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the sound of clinking glasses from the nearby cafe, stood a modest pharmacy called Silver Pines. It was here that Sarah Mitchell dedicated her days to serving her community. A pharmacist for nearly a decade, Sarah was renowned not just for her knowledge of medications, but for her genuine compassion towards her patients. The pharmacy, adorned with vibrant flowers and welcoming smiles, became not just a place to pick up prescriptions, but a sanctuary for individuals who often found themselves lost in the complexities of their health. Each day, as the sun cast warm rays through the large windows, Sarah felt grateful to be a small part of her patients' lives. However, beneath this picturesque facade lay a troubling reality that had slowly begun to erode Sarah's sense of peace. What started as a mere whisper among colleagues had morphed into an unsettling pattern. A noticeable increase in prescriptions for exorbitantly priced medications. The same names appeared repeatedly on the orders. Specialty drugs that came with jaw-dropping price tags, often in the thousands of dollars. On the surface, Sarah understood the importance of effective treatment. Medications developed for complex conditions had their place. Yet, as she analyzed the numbers, a nagging doubt nestled deep within her conscience. Who were these drugs actually benefiting? The turning point came late one Friday afternoon when a regular patient, Mr. Thompson, shuffled into the pharmacy, his expression clouded with worry. Sarah recognized him instantly, a retired schoolteacher who had dedicated his life to nurturing young minds, always a beacon of positivity. Today he wore a frown that tugged at Sarah's heartstrings. "Sarah," he started, his voice tremulous, "I can't afford my medication this month. My insurance barely covers half of it." The words hung heavily in the air, accentuated by the hollow echo of the pharmacy's ticking clock. Mr. Thompson's plight struck Sarah like a lightning bolt. He recounted the difficulty of deciding between his life-saving medication and everyday necessities, bills, groceries, the small pleasures that made life enjoyable. As tears welled in his eyes, he asked, "Why are these medications so expensive? It feels like I'm being punished for needing them." It was a question Sarah found impossible to answer, and the more she thought about it, the larger the web of implications became. That conversation lit a fire within Sarah. It became clear to her that she couldn't turn a blind eye to the disturbing trend anymore. Her sense of duty as a healthcare provider drove her to investigate the underlying issues that seemed to plague the pharmaceutical industry. By peering through the lens of a pharmacist, she began a journey that would not only test her principles, but also challenge the very ethics of the medical system she had devoted her life to serving. What she had stumbled upon was no longer just a fiscal issue. It was a matter of human dignity and moral responsibility. In the vibrant town of Maplewood, where the seasons painted the landscape with hues of change, lived Sarah Thompson, a dedicated pharmacist who stood as a beacon of hope for her community. For over a decade, Sarah had devoted herself to her work at Maplewood Pharmacy, a quaint establishment nestled between the local bakery and the neighborhood diner. With her warm smile and compassionate demeanor, she had become a familiar figure to many. Patients often found solace in her presence, knowing they could rely on her for sound advice and a listening ear. Sarah had always believed that her role transcended simply dispensing medications. She saw herself as a custodian of health, an advocate for her patients' well-being. Every day, as she meticulously filled prescriptions, her commitment to patient care was evident in her interactions. She knew each patient by name, remembering their unique stories and struggles. From the elderly gentleman battling diabetes to the single mother juggling multiple jobs while managing her children's asthma, this personal connection enriched her work, driving her to ensure that everyone who walked through the pharmacy doors felt valued and understood. However, beneath the surface of the comforting routine lay an unsettling tension that Sarah couldn't shake off. Over the past few months, she began to notice an unusual spike in prescriptions for certain high-cost medications. It was perplexing. Patients who once managed their conditions with affordable generics were now receiving prescriptions for exorbitantly priced brand-name drugs. Sarah's instincts, honed through years of experience and interaction, told her something was amiss. Questions swirled in her mind. Why were these medications being prescribed so liberally? Was there a hidden motive that compromised the integrity of patient care? One rainy afternoon, after a particularly busy day at the pharmacy, Sarah had an unexpected encounter that would change everything. A frustrated patient named Lisa approached the counter, her hands gripping a crumpled prescription slip. Tears welled in her eyes as she recounted her struggle to afford the cost of a medication that had just skyrocketed in price. "I feel trapped," Lisa confided, her voice shaking. "This medication is essential for my health, but I can't pay my rent if I buy it." As Sarah listened intently, a mix of empathy and alarm washed over her. Lisa's plight illuminated the harsh reality faced by countless patients, those caught in a web of high pharmaceutical costs that jeopardized their health and financial stability. Sarah felt a profound sense of responsibility to delve deeper into the issue. It was one thing to notice a troubling trend, but to hear a patient's firsthand experience brought a new urgency to her growing suspicions. That very night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The conversation replayed in her mind, and determination surged within her. She knew that the heart of her profession rested on the foundation of trust and transparency. As the stars twinkled outside her window, Sarah resolved to uncover the truth behind the million-dollar prescriptions that plagued her community. Little did she know, this decision would set her on a turbulent path, igniting a quest for justice that would shake the very core of the healthcare system she was committed to serving. As Sarah settled into her routine at Bayview Pharmacy, she couldn't shake the growing unease that had nestled into the pit of her stomach. Every day, she processed countless prescriptions, adhering to the demands of doctors and the expectations of patients. Yet, as the weeks progressed, a peculiar trend began to manifest, unsettling her intuition. At first, it appeared innocuous enough. A handful of prescriptions for high-cost medications trickled in, a fact of life in the field of healthcare. But soon, the trickle turned into a steady stream, a deluge of exorbitantly priced prescriptions that caught her attention. The same expensive medications were being prescribed in alarming frequency, far more than she had ever witnessed during her years as a pharmacist. Names like Seraflex, Trizatex, and Zenoliv danced across her computer screen, each one accompanied by a price tag that seemed to defy logic. As she organized the prescriptions in her workspace, Sarah couldn't help but think about her patients. Many of them struggled to afford their medications, often choosing between their health and other essentials like rent or groceries. Just last week, Mrs. Patel had come in, her eyes watering with worry. "I'm on a fixed income, Sarah. I just can't afford this," she had said, clutching the prescription slip as if it were a lifeline slipping through her fingers. The thought of Mrs. Patel's anguish lingered, fueling Sarah's suspicions. Determined to gather more information, Sarah began to take note of the doctors prescribing these costly medications. She recognized some names, familiar faces from the local hospital, renowned for their expertise. Others, however, were less recognizable, raising further questions. Why were so many seemingly unrelated physicians prescribing the same high-priced drugs? Was it merely coincidence, or was something more sinister at play? As the days turned to weeks, Sarah found her focus narrowing. She began to dissect the data, compiling a list of the medications and their associated prescribers. The results were staggering. It appeared as though a select group of doctors had adopted a standard protocol that favorably skewed towards these pricey prescriptions. They were confident in their decisions, but an unsettling feeling nagged at Sarah. Had they been influenced beyond the realm of patient care? Just then, an incident pushed Sarah's concerns to the forefront. One evening, a young woman named Lily entered the pharmacy in tears, a prescription for an autoimmune medication in hand. "I don't know what to do," she cried. "I can't pay for this. They tell me it's my only option." As Sarah comforted her, she felt a mix of frustration and fury for a system that would charge so much for what was often a matter of life and death. Lily's heartbreaking tale was the final straw, igniting the fire in Sarah's heart. This was no longer just an unusual pattern. It was a glaring sign of something deeply wrong within the healthcare system. With renewed determination, Sarah decided she would investigate further. She was becoming increasingly convinced that these patterns were part of a much larger and murky scheme. linked directly to the pharmaceutical companies and their incessant push for profit over people. The more she probed, the more she realized that uncovering the truth wouldn't just be a personal quest. It could very well become a fight for the rights of numerous patients like Lily and Mrs. Patel, who deserved better than to be caught in the crossfire of corporate greed. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the pharmacy in an amber glow, Sarah took a moment to organize her workspace. The scent of antiseptic mingled with the comforting aroma of herbal teas, grounding her as she prepared for another busy evening. Just as she finished tidying up, the bell above the door jingled, and a frail, middle-aged woman shuffled in, her face marked with worry lines that told a silent story of hardship. "Good evening, Mrs. Thompson," Sarah greeted warmly, recognizing her as a regular customer. "What can I help you with today?" Mrs. Thompson, clutching an empty prescription bottle tightly, sighed heavily, her voice trembling slightly. "I came to refill my medication, Sarah, but I don't know if I can afford it this time." Her eyes, filled with a mix of anxiety and frustration, darted around the pharmacy as if seeking solace in the aisles. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy as she observed the woman's worn hands. Mrs. Thompson had been battling chronic pain for years, relying on medication that frequently cost a small fortune. "Let me check your prescription," Sarah said gently, taking the bottle from Mrs. Thompson and moving to the computer. As she typed in the information, a sinking feeling began to settle in Sarah's stomach. The last refill had already set Mrs. Thompson back nearly $1,000, a staggering sum for someone living on a fixed income. "It looks like the same medication as before," Sarah said, trying to mask her concern. "But let me verify if there are any alternatives." Mrs. Thompson, overhearing the clacking of keys, interjected, "Sarah, I've asked my doctor about alternatives before. He always insists I need this brand. Says it's the only thing that works." Her frustration bubbled over as she continued. "But I can't pay these prices anymore. Sometimes I even wonder if he gets some sort of benefit from pushing this medication. I feel trapped." A spark of realization collided with Sarah's ongoing suspicions about the rising costs and the unusual patterns she had been observing. "What do you mean by benefit?" she inquired, leaning closer. Her curiosity piqued. Mrs. Thompson looked around cautiously before whispering, "I heard from another patient that their doctor receives bonuses for prescribing certain drugs. You know, the expensive ones. It's sickening." She shook her head in disbelief. "I just want to live without pain, not live in debt." The impact of Mrs. Thompson's words hit Sarah hard, igniting a resolve within her. How many others were suffering in silence, burdened by financial strain while healthcare professionals profited from their desperation? As they talked, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was not merely a pharmacist. She was part of a system that, at times, betrayed its most vulnerable patients. After their conversation, Mrs. Thompson left the pharmacy with her prescription. "Thank you for listening, Sarah," she said gratefully, a hint of hope flickering in her tired eyes. "I just want someone to care." As the door swung shut, Sarah stood in silence, contemplating the profound implications of their encounter. This was no longer just about prescriptions. It was about lives, integrity, and the ethical dilemmas that ensnared the very foundations of her profession. She knew then that she had to dig deeper into the unsettling patterns she had begun to notice. For the sake of patients like Mrs. Thompson, and perhaps her own conscience. As Sarah dove deeper into her investigation, the weight of the pharmaceutical industry's influence pressed heavily upon her conscience. Days turned into weeks as she meticulously recorded every unusual prescription pattern, cross-referencing them against the profiles of doctors who wrote them. The sheer volume of high-cost medications prescribed to patients with conditions that often had cheaper alternatives was alarming. Something was off, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was lurking just beneath the surface. One rainy afternoon, while sifting through a mountain of prescription data, Sarah stumbled upon a series of medical conferences organized by a certain pharmaceutical company. Curious, she looked further into the agenda of these events, discovering that they included lavish dinners and high-profile guest speakers. It didn't take long for her to connect the dots. The company had been presenting their latest drugs as the only solution to patients' ailments while systematically sidelining more affordable options that could offer similar results. Her heart raced as she combed through testimonials and documents online, reading about doctors who had been publicly reprimanded for unethical prescribing practices. It was shocking to realize that these weren't isolated incidents. They formed a disturbing trend. She recalled the frustrated patient who shared their story about foregoing necessary medications due to costs. The more Sarah uncovered, the more she understood the magnitude of the predatory behavior infecting the healthcare system, essentially holding the lives of thousands of patients hostage to corporate greed. Determined to document her findings, Sarah began reaching out to former employees of the pharmaceutical companies. She encountered a network of whistleblowers who had witnessed firsthand the grotesque manipulation of the healthcare system. One former rep, a man named Tom, shared chilling insights into how bonuses were tied to sales numbers and how doctors were persuaded to favor certain drugs over others through financial incentives. As he spoke, Sarah felt a mix of anger and clarity. This was no longer just about her suspicions. It was a systematic issue that needed urgent addressing. With each conversation, Sarah collected documents, endorsements, and evidence, piecing together a comprehensive picture of the murky relationship between healthcare providers and pharmaceutical companies. The damning testimonials from patients, coupled with the eye-opening documents illuminating the incentives skewing medical ethics, drew a vivid image of exploitation that would make anyone stop and think. Her anxiety transformed into a passionate resolve. Inspired by the stories of those affected, Sarah decided to compile her findings into a report that would not only expose the corrupt practices but also advocate for transparency in the healthcare system. She created an outline, meticulously annotating every point with concrete evidence. With each page she completed, she felt a surge of purpose. Her commitment to her profession, the patients she served, and the integrity of the healthcare system surged to the forefront of her mind. Armed with new knowledge and unwavering determination, Sarah knew she was stepping onto a dangerous path, but she was more resolute than ever. It was now or never. The truth needed to be told, and she was ready to risk everything to expose the injustices lurking in the shadows of the medical world. As Sarah sat at her desk in the dimly lit pharmacy, papers strewn about with notes and graphs detailing the outrageous prices of the medications, a storm of emotions raged within her. The discoveries she had made in recent weeks weighed heavily on her heart and mind. It was no longer merely a series of troubling prescriptions. It was a complex web of deception and greed that threatened the lives of countless patients relying on medication to sustain their health. The deeper she delved into the issue, the more she realized the severity of the situation. Here she was, caught in a fierce moral dilemma. On one hand, her duty as a pharmacist urged her to protect her patients, advocating for their well-being and ensuring they received the best care possible. On the other hand, the potential consequences of exposing this corrupt network loomed over her like a dark cloud, heavy with the threat of retaliation. The same pharmaceutical companies that dictated the prices, exorbitant by any measure, also had the power to ruin her career with a mere whisper. They could wield their influence to tarnish her reputation, branding her as a troublemaker or worse. As Sarah recalled the faces of her patients, the elderly couple struggling to afford their medication, the single mother who counted every penny to keep her child's asthma in check, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. These were not just faceless numbers in a spreadsheet. They were real lives intertwined with her own. She could no longer stay silent and watch as they suffered from the exorbitant costs of their prescriptions, feeding the powerful pharmaceutical companies while undermining her oath to do no harm. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint chime of the pharmacy's doorbell, heralding the entrance of an elderly gentleman, Mr. Thompson. He shuffled in with his usual 3-day-old stubble and weary eyes, clutching a crumpled prescription in his hand. As he approached the counter, Sarah forced a smile, but it felt shaky under the weight of her worries. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson. How are you today?" she asked, hoping her voice sounded more cheerful than she felt. "Oh, Sarah. Just trying to scrape by," he replied. his voice rasping with age and fatigue. "I'm struggling with these prices. Every time I come here, it feels like I must choose between my medications and my meals." His words struck a chord deep within her, igniting a flame of determination. She could feel the anger twisting in her gut toward a system that profited from the suffering of people like Mr. Thompson. As they spoke, Sarah realized that this man, like so many others, was trapped in a cycle of despair enabled by the very practices she had uncovered. The sheer injustice of it all made her heart race. She took a deep breath, the gravity of her reality settling in. Would she have the courage to stand up against the forces at play? Could she risk everything for the sake of those suffering patients who trusted her? The decision loomed large. But one thing had become clear. She could no longer be a passive observer. Sarah knew she had a choice to make. Continue down a path of complicity or risk everything to seek justice for her patients. As hope began to replace fear, she resolved that she would not let their voices go unheard. In the dim light of her small office, Sarah sat at her desk, her laptop open in front of her, a jumble of thoughts swirling in her mind. The weight of the unethical practices she had uncovered pressed heavily on her heart. She knew that the network of deceit within the pharmaceutical industry was vast and powerful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had a responsibility to act. Inspired by the faces of patients like Ms. Thompson, the elderly woman who had nearly gone bankrupt trying to afford her medication, Sarah steeled herself for the challenge ahead. Determined to gather evidence, Sarah began by meticulously documenting every suspicious prescription order that crossed her counter. She created a spreadsheet filled with details, patient names, medication names, costs, and the prescribing doctors. Each entry painted a picture of a healthcare system that prioritized profit over patient welfare. As days turned into weeks, the compilation grew, providing a stark visual representation of the disturbing trend she had stumbled upon. But Sarah knew that mere data wasn't enough. She needed concrete proof of the corruption infiltrating her workplace. With each passing day, she started reaching out to trusted colleagues, discreetly discussing her findings. She carefully selected a few who she believed shared her commitment to ethical healthcare: the quiet nurse, Mark, who often expressed dissatisfaction with hospital protocols, and Elena, an intern who had a knack for ferreting out information. Their passion for patient welfare matched her own, and slowly, her small team began to form. Together, they mapped out a plan. It was risky, putting their careers on the line, but it felt necessary. They decided to approach their gathered evidence strategically. First, Sarah and Mark agreed to confront a physician known to be a major player in this web of deceit, Dr. Scott. They made an appointment under the pretense of discussing a patient case, hoping to catch him off guard. The night before the meeting, Sarah rehearsed her words, her heart racing at the thought of what they might uncover. On the day of their confrontation, Sarah's palms were sweaty, but she took a deep breath, steadied by the urgency of her mission. The meeting played out as planned, and under pressure, Dr. Scott let slip comments that hinted at the arrangement he had with pharmaceutical representatives. Sarah felt a rush of adrenaline. This was the evidence they needed to solidify their claims. In the following weeks, Sarah and her allies grew bolder. They began to gather testimonies from patients who had been adversely affected by the rising costs of medications linked to unethical prescribing practices. Each story was a poignant reminder of what was at stake: lives hanging in the balance over profits. Armed with their findings, Sarah felt the gravity of her mission pull her forward. It was time to escalate their efforts. They decided to compile everything: data, testimonies, and documentation of Dr. Scott's admissions into a comprehensive report. With each keystroke, hope replaced fear in Sarah's heart. Her plan was taking shape, and she could almost see the light at the end of the tunnel. This would be her contribution to dismantling the corrupt system that had caused so much pain. She believed in the truth, and with it, she hoped to inspire others to join the fight for ethical healthcare. The gears of change were in motion, and Sarah prepared herself for the storm that was surely about to come. The air was thick with tension as Sarah stood in the dimly lit back office of the hospital, her heart racing. She had spent months collecting evidence, meticulously documenting every instance of unethical behavior she had witnessed. The network of doctors who had colluded with pharmaceutical companies to push outrageously priced prescriptions now felt like a sprawling web of deceit that she had unearthed. With each passing day, the stakes grew higher, and Sarah knew she was risking everything, even her career, by pursuing the truth. Just as she was about to finalize her report, Sarah received a message that sent chills down her spine. An anonymous tip warned her that powerful entities were aware of her investigation and that they wouldn't hesitate to protect their interests at any cost. She felt paralyzed for a moment, fear gripping her like a vice. But the thought of the patients, struggling under the weight of financial burdens for the sake of medications they desperately needed, lit a fire in her heart. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself against the rising tide of anxiety. Days later, she decided to meet with a few trusted colleagues who were sympathetic to her cause. They met in a small cafe away from prying eyes, their faces shrouded in concern. "We have to do something, Sarah. This isn't just about us anymore," one of her colleagues, Mark, said. "Patients are suffering while these companies profit off their desperation." They deliberated over a strategy, realizing that they needed to act quickly before the pharmaceutical giants silenced them for good. However, as the plan materialized, Sarah received a chilling phone call late one night. A deep voice on the other end warned her to cease her investigation or face severe consequences. The caller's threats were palpable and left her shaken. "You think you can take down the pharmaceutical industry? You'll regret it if you proceed." The line went dead, leaving Sarah in a storm of worry and doubt. Despite the fear, she felt an insatiable drive to expose the truth. With the support of her colleagues, they pulled together their findings, intending to present them at an upcoming hospital board meeting. This was it, her chance to confront the system and advocate for change. As the meeting approached, however, intimidation tactics escalated. Unmarked cars lingered outside her house, and she received anonymous letters warning her to stop digging. The night before the meeting, her resolve was tested as she lay awake, contemplating if exposing the truth was worth the risk. Would speaking out not only jeopardize her job, but also endanger her loved ones? Yet, as she thought of the patients and their desperation, Sarah knew she had no other choice. The day of reckoning arrived. Her heart pounded as she entered the boardroom, flanked by her loyal colleagues. Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressed against her chest, an overwhelming blend of fear and determination. Armed with the evidence she had gathered, she was ready to confront those who had prioritized profit over people. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a fierce fight for justice, integrity, and ethical responsibility in healthcare. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden hue over the hospital, Sarah stood backstage, her heart racing in anticipation. The atmosphere was electric, buzzing with the murmurs of concerned citizens, healthcare professionals, and reporters gathered for the hospital board meeting. This was it, the moment she had worked so hard for, risking everything to expose the truth behind the sky-high medication prices that were suffocating patients. Deep breaths in, deep breaths out. She could hear the faint whispers of doubt echoing in her mind, reminding her of the threats she'd received from the pharmaceutical companies. They had tried relentlessly to keep her silent, leveraging their influence over the hospital and even going as far as to question her credibility. But today was different. Today, she was no longer alone in her fight. With the help of a few trusted allies who believed in her cause, Sarah had gathered undeniable evidence, a meticulously compiled dossier of kickbacks, emails, and contracts that revealed the disturbing nexus between doctors and pharmaceutical companies. The meeting began, and the board members took their seats, their expressions a mix of indifference and skepticism. Sarah's palms were clammy, and she could feel the weight of her case file in her hands, a tangible representation of her resolve. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped forward, the bright lights shining down on her, illuminating the path to truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath the surface, "I stand before you not just as a pharmacist, but as a representative of every patient who has suffered under the burden of unreasonably priced medications. What I am about to reveal should concern us all." She presented her findings, each revelation hitting like tidal waves against the apathy in the room. As she showcased damning evidence of doctors who were wholly entangled in the web of pharmaceutical greed, she saw the discontented whispers transform into gasps of disbelief. Emails sprung to life on the projector screen, conversations between physicians and pharmaceutical sales reps discussing bonuses for prescribing specific medications, with no regard for patient need. Here, Sarah pointed to a graph illustrating the skyrocketing costs of medications prescribed versus the actual necessity for them. You can see the shocking correlation between the increased profits of these companies and the prescriptions written. This practice is not only unscrupulous, it's detrimental to public health. The tension in the room grew palpable as she noticed the uncomfortable shifting of board members, their faces paling as the intricate details of collusion and ethical violations unfolded. With each fact unveiled, the audience's anger and disbelief began to coalesce, igniting a fierce determination among many present. Her voice rose, fueled by urgency. This cannot continue. We must hold ourselves accountable. Patients deserve transparency and fair pricing. It's our duty as medical professionals to prioritize their well-being over profits. Together, we can ignite a movement for ethical practices in medicine. The applause was overwhelming, booming like thunder as her plea echoed through the packed room. People were on their feet, and she could see the fire in their eyes, a passion for reform that mirrored her own. Sarah had sparked a movement, and with her courageous act of defiance, she had rallied a community ready to stand against the corrupt systems that had threatened to silence her. What started as a singular quest for justice had transformed into a collective voice demanding change, a testament to the power of one courageous individual daring to confront the profound moral issues within the healthcare system. As the dust settled after Sarah's bold presentation to the hospital administration and the public, a profound sense of change began to ripple through the healthcare community. News outlets picked up her story, sparking discussions on ethics and accountability in medical practices across the nation. Patients, once voiceless under the weight of exorbitant medical bills and despair, found renewed hope and empowerment as they joined the movement Sarah had inspired. In the weeks that followed, Sarah witnessed the tangible impact of her courage. Hospitals began to reassess their relationships with pharmaceutical companies, and new policies emerged to regulate prescription habits. Doctors were now encouraged to prioritize patient welfare over profit, reminding themselves of their sworn oath to do no harm. Team meetings in hospitals now frequently included discussions of ethical considerations, enhancing a culture of integrity and transparency that had long been overshadowed by monetary incentives. However, her journey did not come without costs. Sarah received threats, and whispers of retaliation circulated among the powerful allies she had once seen as mentors. Yet, fortified by an unwavering belief that she was fighting for the very lives of her patients, Sarah stood tall against the intimidation tactics employed by the pharmaceutical giants. The allies she gathered became her support system, using their platforms to echo her message of ethics and integrity within their respective fields. In a special town hall meeting organized following the uproar, Sarah took the stage again, this time not only as a pharmacist but as a community leader. The audience was filled with both supporters and skeptics, but the atmosphere crackled with anticipation of change. With heartfelt sincerity, Sarah shared personal stories of patients who had suffered under the burden of financial toxicity wrought by unnecessary prescriptions. Each account was a reminder of the real-world implications behind the statistics. They were not just numbers. They were lives altered by corrupt practices. As she concluded her address, she spoke about the transformative power of collective action and the responsibility that everyone bears, within the healthcare system and beyond. Sarah passionately urged the audience to advocate for themselves and each other, emphasizing that vigilance and integrity must be the cornerstone of their collective struggle against injustice. We must hold each other accountable, for it is our compassion that drives us to ensure that every person has access to affordable and necessary medical care, she proclaimed, her voice echoing through the auditorium. The applause that followed was thunderous, reverberating with hope and determination. Sarah knew that the journey was just beginning, but as she stood before her community, She felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. As we reflect on Sarah's journey, let it serve as a crucial reminder that integrity in the healthcare system is not just a lofty ideal but a mandatory principle. When individuals dare to challenge corruption and fight for justice, they pave the way for change that echoes far beyond their own experiences. We invite you to share your thoughts about Sarah's story in the comments below. What are your views on ethics in healthcare? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more engaging stories that inspire change and bring light to important social issues. Together, we can create a ripple effect of awareness and action,